Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Gaining Ground webinar. Today's topic is going to be insect ecology in urban and rural food systems. For those of you unfamiliar with Gaining Ground, this is a free webinar series geared towards agricultural educators to disseminate knowledge from national experts in topics that are of relevance to the target audience. Most of these topics include financing, business management, and marketing for such enterprises, and they're funded by the North Central SARE. Once again, today's topic is insect ecology in urban and rural food systems, and we are pleased to welcome our presenter, Dr. Tania Kim. She's a broadly trained community and landscape ecologist and the principal investigator of the Kim Insect Ecology Lab. With that, I'll let Dr. Kim introduce herself more if she wishes.
Okay, thank you. Let me share. Let's see what's going on here. Okay, swap the settings here. All right, do you see everything fine in the proper mode?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. I am an assistant professor in the entomology department at K-State, and I'm going to ecology in urban and rural food systems using ecology to inform insect management. Full disclosure, most of my work is in rural systems, so it's not going to be a lot of principles that I'll be talking about in rural food systems can certainly be applied in urban food systems. So I am an ecologist, so I am interested in trying to understand biotic and abiotic factors that affect where insects are found and their biodiversity. Specifically, I'm a landscape ecologist, interested in how land use and land management affects insect biodiversity and the ecological functions that they perform. So I work in a number of systems, semi-natural systems like these grasslands that are managed through fire and grazing. But I also work in these heavily managed systems like agricultural fields that are sometimes intensively managed, sometimes a little less so. I work with both insects like insect pests here, like aphids and grasshoppers, as well as beneficial insects like this lady beetle and pollinators. And so the ecological functions that I mainly look at are crop damage for the insect pests, biological control, so eating pest insects for the predators here, and pollination services for the pollinators. So acknowledge my students that some of which have graduated. They are all involved in some aspect of insect management and using ecology to manage insects. So on the left here, Mario Ponce, he is a graduating PhD student. He works mostly in stored products, so post-harvest, looking at how insects and microbes interact and using this knowledge to manage grain pests. Maggie Anderson is a master's student, also graduating pretty soon. She is interested in looking at how prairie strips can augment beneficial insects such as these ground beetles. These ground beetles are great because predators on other insect pests, but they also feed on seeds, especially weed seeds, so they're great for weed management. Nicole Kucherov is interested in invasive species and trying to understand their spread in our agricultural landscapes. So she works primarily in soybean and is interested in looking at Japanese beetle, which is both a rural pest as well as a urban pest, and trying to understand how land use as well as climate change is affecting their spread across the US. Gus Brunette, he is a new master's student interested in pollinators. He is looking at pollinators in tallgrass prairie, or in the different prairie types that we have in Kansas. We have this nice precipitation gradient as you go from east to west. And so he's looking at relationships between precipitation and these bee communities. And then on the right here, two of my students that have graduated, Hannah Stowe, she is now a PhD student at UNL. She did a lot of work on native lady beetles and trying to understand how diet affects their fecundity and their fitness. And Jessica Butters is now a pollinator biologist in Iowa, and she looked at management practices and how those affect beneficial insects. So I just kind of wanted to show you kind of what we're doing in the lab, but I'm only going to be talking about a few of these particular projects. Okay, so a question that I often get asked is, why should I consider landscapes? Insects are really tiny, so why consider things that are happening at much broader spatial scales? And the reason for that is because insects move. They move for a number of different reasons, particularly migration. So insects like monarchs, for example, will have these great migrations. During winter, when temperatures are cooler, they'll migrate south to Mexico in their rainforests, primarily because these insects can't overwinter in cold areas. And then when the temperature changes, when it gets warm, they kind of migrate back north. Insect pests do that as well. So these aster leafhoppers, they can't overwinter in cold areas. And so they affect a lot of aster plants, particularly canola. And so, in the Northern Great Plains and in Canada, these aster leafhoppers, move up from these southern states kind of on a yearly basis. All right. Insects also move because they have certain parts of their life cycles that require them to be in different habitat types. So a good example of that are mosquitoes. They are semi-aquatic in that, their egg stage, the larval stage, the pupa stage require water. And so they'll be in water. And then when the adult emerges, they're in a completely different environment, this terrestrial environment. And, females need a blood meal before they can continue on with the cycle here. But there are also insect pests that require different habitats. So for example, this is a soybean aphid life cycle. As the name suggests, it is a pest in soybean, but in the fall, they overwinter in buckthorn, which is along the forest edges. And so they overwinter there as eggs. In early spring, they'll emerge, undergo asexual reproduction, and then form wings and migrate into the soybean, okay? And insects must move also because they are foraging for food. So this lady beetle right here that's eating this aphid, oftentimes will move across the landscape as food becomes, depleted in one area and starts growing in another area. So for example, this wheat field here, from a lady beetle perspective, there's not much food there. They'll kind of hop over into soybean here, where aphid populations are starting to increase. So they'll be moving across the landscape, trying to search for food. They're also searching for plant matter. Pollen and nectar are very important for lady beetle diet, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then, of course, pollinators are looking around for food. They are a little different than our predatory insects in that they are what we call central place foragers. So they have nests that sort of keep them grounded in certain areas, and they'll sort of like go out and find food and come back. But they will be foraging quite a long distance, trying to find food resources in both these kind of semi-natural areas like grasslands, as well as these intensely managed crop fields. Okay, so I take this landscape approach to try to manage these insects. And so I look at factors that are happening at really broad spatial scales, as well as how to manage local fields for both pests and pollinator management. We try to look for ways to promote beneficial insects and at the same time deter pest insects. And this type of management is called integrated pest and pollinator management, or IPPM. All right, so many of you have probably heard about what IPM is, but just for those of you who haven't, here's a definition of IPM. IPM is an ecosystem-based strategy that focuses on the management of pests and their damage using a combination of sustainable techniques that minimizes risks to humans and wildlife. So the key terms here are that they are ecosystem-based, so they're based on ecology. There's a combination of techniques that are used that are sustainable, and we're trying to minimize risk. IPPM, on the other hand, has a very similar definition in that, again, it's ecosystem-based. It involves a combination of techniques that are sustainable and minimizes risk. But now we're co-managing both pollinators and pests. And the goal for IPPM is to minimize trade-offs between pest management and pollinator management, and to maximize co-benefits or synergies that might occur. Okay, and so this is just kind of a graphical illustration of how IPPM works. So, there are a number of factors that will affect pest populations, as well as predators and pollinators. So we're trying to find these shared factors or these shared drivers that will simultaneously, reduce these pest populations and augment the beneficial predators as well as pollinators. And the goal here is to increase crop performance and ultimately increase crop yield. All right, so this is a typical diagram kind of showing you the different control tactics under IPM. So some of you have seen this, but at the base of this triangle, we're trying to look at these preventative measures to control insects. And as we move up the triangle, we're increasing intervention and increasing toxicity. So at the base of this triangle, these are cultural control practices. So these are things like, modifying our agricultural practices through, selecting different varieties that may be resistant to insect pests, selecting certain sites that are historically, less vulnerable to damage, increasing fertility to our plants. A healthier plant means that they're able to withstand a little bit of damage. Crop rotation as well as sanitation are good examples of cultural control. And as we move up this pyramid, we are increasing intervention. So physical or mechanical control includes creating these barriers to prevent insects from coming in, or these traps, weeding, mulching, and rototilling. Biological control involves releasing biological control agents, which include predators, parasitoids, and pathogens that may cause diseases to pests. And then at the tip of the triangle here, we've got chemical control. At the lower part of the triangle, we've got biorational pesticides, insect growth regulators, repellents, and microbial microbes, as well as oils. These are relatively less toxic than our conventional pesticides, which are at the very tip. And so we want to minimize using chemical control in favor for these preventative measures, primarily cultural control. IPPM has a similar model in that we are trying to use these proactive or preventative measures for controlling insects, and then increasing intervention through the use of pesticides and artificial pollination. The management practices at the tip of the triangle are really inputs that humans put into the system, whereas at the base of the triangle, we're really focused on preserving biodiversity. And so the goals of IPPM are to simultaneously reduce insect pests while promoting beneficial insects. Okay, so the work that I do really focuses on the bottom part of this triangle, trying to manage landscapes as well as crop fields to reduce pests and promote beneficials. All right, so how do these proactive or these preventative measures affect insects? This requires knowing a little bit about insect biology. So these measures affect the way in which insects search for food and ultimately colonize a field. So as this butterfly here is, flying above a field, she's looking for a place to lay her eggs. And so we're trying to find practices that would, deter her from laying eggs if she's a pest insect. Once within the field, we are trying to find local practices that can interfere with her being able to select a host plant. And then finally, if she's having trouble finding a place to lay eggs or feed, then she'll leave. Okay. So these proactive strategies really focus on these factors up here. Okay, and so when insects are trying to find a place to land, to eat, or to lay eggs, they're using a multitude of environmental cues that are happening in a hierarchical fashion. So first, insects are using these visual cues. So they're oftentimes flying overhead. They'll use visual cues to find places to land. So obviously a field that only has a host plant, let's say a monoculture here, they're going to be much easier to find than these fields on the bottom that have different crops, even more so in the landscape on the right, which is very heterogeneous. So including a mixture of non-host plants makes it difficult for those pest insects to find, to decide where to land. Within the field, they're using other cues. So a lot of insects will use olfactory cues like smell to find their host plants. So again, a field that has a lot of host plants or a lot of individuals from the same species will emit a stronger volatile signal. And that will be easier to find than a field that might have a mixture of non-host plants. And so that's why things like diversified plantings are great for reducing pest insects, because it confuses the insects. And as the insects get confused, they have a difficulty finding places to either eat or lay eggs that ultimately leave the habitat. All right. So using these principles for landscape management, I look at ways in which we can understand landscape diversity and how they may affect pests, beneficial insects, and pollinators. And so a lot of my research involves, measuring biodiversity in these different landscapes. So for example, the landscape on top is considered a complex or diverse landscape. Compared to this more simplified landscape down at the bottom, where it is kind of annual agriculture and there are really, really large fields. And I measure biodiversity of both predatory insects on top here, as well as pest insects, these herbivores on the bottom here. And the hypothesis here is that these complex landscapes should support a greater number and diversity of these predators compared to these simplified landscapes, primarily because there's a lot of different food resources in these complex landscapes. And because these predators eat herbivores, we expect herbivore numbers to be lower in these complex landscapes as opposed to these simplified landscapes. Okay. So what does that mean for plants? Well, because predators are eating herbivores and herbivores have negative effects on plants, we predict that predators will have this indirect positive effect on plants mediated through herbivores. Okay, and so that's really the premise of biological control. All right, so there have been a number of studies that have looked at how these different landscape types affect biodiversity of predators and pest insects. So this was a meta-analysis that was done kind of a long time ago now, but they looked at 46 sites or 46 studies and found generally predators, specialists, generalists tend to be in greater numbers in these complex landscapes up here compared to these simplified landscapes. Predation rates as well as parasitism rates on pest insects seem to be greater. Their abundance and diversity tend to be greater in these complex landscapes. So overall, there seems to be this positive association with landscape complexity and predator communities. When you look at the pest insects, the story gets a little unclear. So pest insects, we tend to see generalist pests slightly higher in numbers in these complex landscapes rather than these simplified landscapes. However, for specialists, we see a slight increase, but it's not statistically different from zero. We see a lot of damage happening in crops within these complex landscapes. But then we also see growth rates of these pest insects being greater in these simplified landscapes. Okay. So overall, there doesn't seem to be a general pattern with pest insects with regard to the landscape type. Again, what does that mean for plants? So a few studies have been able to connect landscape features with insect, predator biodiversity, herbivore biodiversity, and bring it down to plants. And so this was something that I did for my postdoc at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Here we looked at relationships between these predatory insects, these natural enemies, their effect on aphids, specifically the soybean aphids and the soybean plant. For those of you not familiar with soybean aphid, this project was done in the upper Midwest in Wisconsin and Michigan. Soybean aphid is an invasive pest that has a lot of damage to soybean up in the upper Midwest here. They were first documented in Wisconsin in the early 2000s. And natural enemy communities have been shown to suppress these aphid populations if there's sufficient natural habitat in the landscape. Okay. So we did this experiment first to see whether these insects can indeed suppress aphid populations. So I'm going to show you this graph here. We had these treatments where we had soybean and we had inoculated them with soybean aphids. So a nice thing about soybean aphids is that they don't move. Unlike other aphids, once they're on a plant, they'll just start feeding right away. So we had soybean plants here inoculated with aphids. We had these closed cages, which prevented lady beetles and other predators from accessing the aphids. And then we had these semi-open cages, which, blocked some of the light as the closed cages did, but also allowed these predatory arthropods to go in and feed. And so this study was done in 2011 as well as 2012. And so what we found here was that in cages that were really closed off, we tended to find greater aphid densities in both years compared to cages that were open. And again, that just means that these predators are feeding on these aphids. And so what does that mean for plants? Well, we found that in the first year that these open cages where predators had access to the aphids, we found a slight yield increase. But we didn't find that effect in 2012. And 2012 was a drought year in the upper Midwest. So, these plants were experiencing, a lot of abiotic stress more than these biotic factors. Okay. So we found that at least in 1 year, these predators were having an impact on plant biomass. Okay. And that, again, suggests that the biological control service that they're providing is actually having an impact on yield. Okay, so how do we augment these predators? We looked at soybean fields across a gradient of landscape complexity. We had these soybean fields situated in these really complex landscapes on the right, and then we had soybean fields in these really simplified landscapes on the left, and everything kind of in between. And so generally what we found was that as you increase the heterogeneity or the complexity in the landscapes, you generally found more predators. And that effect seems to be stronger in 2011 compared to 2012. Again, 2012 was a drought, so that explains kind of low numbers overall. What we found was that when you have more predators, you actually have greater predation rates. So they're munching on those soft body aphids more. And then greater predation rates means that we get greater soybean yield. Okay. So generally, these complex landscapes provide benefits to growers through their effects on predatory arthropods and their effect on aphid pests. For pollinators, we see a similar effect of landscape context on pollinator biodiversity. So this was a meta-analysis done, again, kind of over a decade ago in Ecology Letters, showing how landscape complexity, so they use this Longsdorff index, as landscape complexity increased, bee abundance increased as well as bee richness. So this is the number of different bee species. And that effect seemed to be stronger depending on the local management type of the field. So organic fields that were polycultures tend to benefit from landscape complexity more so than these simple conventional fields. Okay, so now how can we manage our fields to reduce pests as well as beneficials? So there's, again, a lot of cultural control practices out there that can help to reduce insect pests. So cultural control is basically, again, the deliberate modification of production practices to reduce pests and their damage. So things like diversified plantings here on the left, crop rotations, intercropping, selecting different varieties, the timing of planting, all of this, makes it so that the crop is not available to the plant. So these are great strategies for pest suppression, but some cultural control practices for pests are at odds with pollinator conservation. A good example of that is the use of trap crops. So trap crop is, a crop that is attractive to a pest insect. Those pest insects go to that crop and move away from the main crop. So in this diagram here, the trap crop is placed or planted along the border. This middle picture here shows you, I believe, some brassica here, which are the trap crops, and you can also intercrop within your field. So these are marigolds right here. And so trap crops in and of themselves aren't effective. You kind of need to supplement that with some sort of kill strategy. So using pesticides, targeted pesticide uses, as well as strip harvesting will need to be done in order to remove those pests that are on those plants. Otherwise, those pests will just kind of spill over and move onto the main crops once they're done feeding. And so this is problematic because a lot of beneficial insects like honeybees and ladybugs also are attracted to these flowering plants. And so by putting out these trap crops that are meant for insect pests, we are inadvertently creating these ecological traps for our beneficial insects. So trying to find trap crops that, attract pests but not beneficial insects is going to be crucial. Tillage is another practice that, benefits for pest suppression. So tillage will kill insect pests that will overwinter in the soil. And so this is true for things like corn earworm. They overwinter as larvae in the soil, and tilling up the soil will expose that pupa. It'll dry out and it'll not metamorphosize. But there's a lot of pollinators. In fact, 80% of our pollinators are below ground nesting insects. This tillage can kill these beneficial insects. And a lot of these insects are nesting. They have very, very shallow nests. So even kind of tilling not a great depth will have impacts on our ground nesting bees. Okay, so we want to adopt practices that benefit both beneficials as well as pests. Again, diversified plantings is a good way to do that, including flowering plants, and those diversified plantings would be great, such as this picture right here. Again, it attracts pollinators, but also will could potentially make it hard for these aphids to find their host plants. Again, having a bunch of odors being emitted into the field, again, makes it hard for these aphids to find their host plants. These diversified plantings, again, these flowering plants are great for predatory insects like lady beetles as well. A lot of lady beetles require pollen and nectar for supplementary vitamins. My work by Hannah Stowe, who is a former master's student, looked at different diet types and how that affected survival and fecundity of native lady beetles. And what she found was that lady beetles that were given an omnivorous diet, so a diet that had insect base as well as plant protein and plant vitamins, tended to produce more babies than lady beetles that were given only this prey-only diet. And the benefit of this mixed diet was stronger with smaller lady beetles compared to larger ones. Okay. Plant diversity is important, but perenniality is also important. So having plants that aren't going to be, uprooted every year is super important. Looked at different planting types. She had perennial plants like a monoculture of cup plants, silkflower, and a diverse prairie mixture, as well as flowering plants such as alfalfa and sainfoin. And what she found generally is that it's not diversified plantings such as prairies per se that is augmenting the bee community. It's this perenniality that's out there. It's not disturbing the soil for nesting purposes. All right, some other practices that will benefit both vegetables and pets include creating these refuges. So these are undisturbed or untreated areas. We do this a lot when we're trying to slow down Bt resistance, particularly in corn. So, for every, a lot of the corn out there, pretty much all the corn out there is Bt. Required to have areas that are non-Bt, either adjacent to the field or planted kind of within the field or in the pivot corners, for example. And the premise behind huge is to maintain these susceptible populations. So if you just had a field with Bt, to have resistant varieties evolving relatively quickly. By having refuges nearby, you're maintaining the susceptible population. So when they breed, their offspring are going to be susceptible. So we're slowing resistance that way. So providing these refuges also important for natural enemies and pollinators. Again, these refuges are nesting insects. Their offspring won't get damaged, but then also these refuges provide additional food resources. Work by my master's student, Maggie, is kind of looking at the importance of refuges for beneficial insects like these ground beetles. So she's looking at soybean fields that have these prairie plantings, these refuges nearby, and comparing them with soybean fields that don't. And generally what she found was that for predatory insects like lady beetles, soybean sites next to these grassy refuges seem to have more predatory insects than soybean fields that don't, that are situated next to corn fields. And then you see the opposite for pest insects. These soybean fields that are really close to these grassy refuges tend to have fewer pests compared to the ones, the soybean fields that are next to things like. What does that mean for the services that they provide, the pest control and the pollination services? This was a meta-analysis done not too long ago, kind of showing you the benefits of having floral strips for pest control and pollination. And generally what they found was these floral strips seem to have a positive impact on pest control. However, hedgerows like the one on the bottom left don't seem to have too much of a general positive impact. Pollination strips, both hedgerows and flower strips, don't seem to have a consistent effect on pollination services. But there's a lot of variation here. And a lot of that variation is due to kind of the spatial location of those strips. In the same review, they looked at the impact of having these, floral enhancements on pest control services and pollination services as a function of distance from the edge. And what they found was that for pest control, that difference in fields with or without those floral plantings seemed to be greater. You see that pest control service anywhere from 20 meters to 40 meters into the crop interior, whereas the pollination services, you really see a difference between fields with flower plantings and without. At the edge of the field, their differences become really, really small as you move into the interior of the field. So in this case, the arrangement, rather than having them along the edges, having them within the field will maximize pollination services. All right, so what does that mean for urban agriculture? A lot of these fundamental concepts apply to urban agriculture. So again, we are looking at practices that will promote beneficial insects while suppressing harmful insects. These rural landscapes on top compared to these urban landscapes. The first being plot sizes. That kind of leads to a lot of different ecological as well as social reasons for why we might see differences. Right, tell me if you can't hear me because I just got my internet's unstable. But anyways, these smaller fields are going to be harder for insects to find compared to these open large fields. Smaller fields are going to be harder for farmers to set aside refuges compared to these large areas. Proximity to people will have impacts on the insect communities. So having people around will make it harder for insects to find their host plants. So that could potentially when you're talking about pest insects, but a bad thing when you're talking about pollinators. But a good thing about being around people is that the use of chemical insecticides will be much lower, in contrast to these rural areas where people are more likely to spray insecticide. And then these different fields are going to be isolated from one another. There's less connectivity between these different urban farms compared to more rural. And again, that's going to affect how insects find these patches and how they move between patches. Again, when you're talking about pest insects and preventing spread, having isolated patches are great, but when you're talking about beneficial insects, it's good to have some sort of connectivity between these areas. Okay, so all these factors will limit insect movement and colonization, in addition to the types of farming practice options available. All right, so moving forward, I am very interested in looking at whether these IPP strategies that I talked about in rural areas can actually apply to urban systems. And if not, I'm really interested in trying to understand, what are the ecological factors that are preventing or causing these differences, and what are some of the social factors that are contributing to those differences as well. So I'm working with Rebecca Lane and Carrie Rivard on a project to try to tackle some of these questions. Rebecca's doing a project this summer looking at insect biodiversity in urban centers, urban farms, peri-urban farms, as well as rural farms, and measuring biodiversity of pest insects, beneficial insects, and functions that they perform. And we're gonna try to attempt to look at how these factors that I mentioned previously impact the biodiversity of these arthropods. In the lab that are currently in the lab, including postdocs and students, my collaborators, both at Kansas State, UW-Madison, as well as nonprofits such as the Land Institute. I have a number of landowners helped over the years, and then my fund sources. And I'm happy to take any questions if this is a topic that interests you. I'm at K-State main campus. My contact information is on the screen here, and I'm happy to have a discussion.
All right, so it looks like a few people have already gotten started using our question and answer function, and that is the perfect place to put questions.
Yeah, so the first one says, is there a list of recommended plants for urban farms to promote IPPM? So not really. I think the field is pretty open right now. Anecdotally, planting things like onions and garlics are great for bringing in parasitic wasps that will feed on soft-bodied insects. A lot of the tiny bees are attracted to that. A lot of the insect pests aren't attracted to that. They like some of the more broad-leafed plants. You want to stay away from things like milkweed. We love milkweed. It's great for monarchs, but they'll bring in monarchs, but they'll also bring a lot of aphids in. So part of the stuff that we want to do is try to come up with a list of plants that could be good for bringing in beneficials, but also not bring in those pest insects. So we're working on that. There are some anecdotal things, but nobody has really sort of tested that in an experimental setting.
Similar to Paul's question, I was going to ask, are there any plants you would recommend avoiding that are really prominent host plants for harmful insects?
Yeah, so like I said, I think the milkweed is probably one of them. Those guys, again, aphids, well, the oleander aphid will just kind of, once they find it, they'll just proliferate. And there's questions about whether those oleander aphids will sort of spill over into our crop plants. So generally, we recommend avoiding those. Parsley is not the greatest either. Again, those flowering plants are great for the butterflies, but there are a lot of caterpillars, a lot of eggs that are laid in those. So again, we're trying to find kind of the good plants and the not so great plants, and make recommendations in the near future. All right. There's other questions here. Do you know where you'll be conducting some of my urban studies? I do not. And so this is where Dr. Rivard and Rebecca come in. They certainly have contacts out there. I'm in Manhattan, so I'm not too familiar with the farms out there, but I'm hoping to become more familiar this summer. So if anybody is interested in participating in this, we'd be happy to, get your contact information. So are there cover crops that should be avoided because they attract pests? It kind of depends. So cover crops are great because they actually attract a lot of, they're great for soil reasons, right? But they can be good for beneficial insects. So some of the work that I did in Wisconsin looked at cover crops, and they did attract a lot of, they attracted insects, but they attracted more beneficial insects like lady beetles. And the benefits of having the cover crops is that those lady beetles stayed into the crop and sort of spilled over into the next crop that was planted. So that was the use of cover crops for pest management was actually seen as a plus. So I suggest, having cover crops for sure in your system. They might attract pests, but they'll attract the beneficials more than the pests. Right, I'm in Arizona. It has been recommended to add water source for beneficial pollinators. What would a water source for insect look like? Any source of water. Bird baths are great. We have a bird bath that, our bumblebees like. I'm not quite sure if that's kind of what you're looking for, but yeah, pollinators are looking for water sources. Some of the work that I did at the Conser Prairie around here, we did seem to find more pollinators in areas that are, kind of depressed that seem to accumulate water more than in areas that are typically dry. So yeah, these pollinators are typically hanging around areas that have some sort of water source. But a lot of these pollinators also can move quite a long distance. So even if you yourself don't have a water source, it could be that your neighbors might. Any other questions? Whoa, what? Okay. Yeah, can you talk about landscape complexity? How do you measure it? Good question. So we do that using ArcGIS, so a mapping software. We will, get coordinates, lat longs. Usually it's the center of a particular field, and then we'll have maps that will characterize the different landscapes around that particular field. And so the area that we like to measure, at least for beneficials, is about 1.5 kilometers up to 2 kilometers surrounding a particular field. Again, these insects can move quite a bit on a daily basis, so that's kind of enough of a range to have an impact of what's happening locally. And so, yeah, in ArcGIS, what we do is, we create what we call these buffers or these circles around our fields. And then we use maps to characterize, the different types of land that's there, their area, how much edge habitat, sometimes those edges really matter. There's a lot of different metrics that we use. For my particular projects, we used, the number of different habitat types. So that's like landscape diversity, but also the amount of perennial habitat. Yes, thanks. Do you anticipate your urban studies to include indoor growing such as high tunnels or greenhouses, or primarily outdoor growing? I think that for the first stab, the work that we're doing this summer, we're going to focus on outdoors, simply because it may be easier. It's hard to talk about pollination, natural pollination and natural pest control in enclosed systems. In closed systems, you're actually bringing those things in. So I think, first run through, we're going to just kind of focus on the outdoor growing. Is there a resource that you can visit to understand insect movement? I don't know what you meant by like a literature. Yeah, I can provide some literature. I can't think of anything on the top of my head for understanding insect movement. It's a field that people kind of realize is very important, but is very hard to quantify simply because unlike, plants that don't move or, wildlife, you can just kind of throw a tag onto them and use radio telemetry to find them. Insect movement is really hard because, they're small. It's hard to track them. We did some work in recapture studies where we capture insects, mark them, release them, and try to find out, capture them some distance away. That's really hard because, again, they're, insects are really small, they're really tiny, they could hide in places. So, there are some resources out there that talk about kind of the biomechanics of moving and why insects may move. But studies that actually have quantified insect movement is a little bit, there's not much out there. There's some genetic work out there to talk about, gene flow and how many genes are mixing through movement. But for movement that's happening sort of more on the ecological timescale, there's probably less out there, but there are some out there, and I'm happy to provide some references. All right. Do you connect your outreach and share your results with homeowners or mostly farmers? So right now it's mostly been farmers, simply because I'm working on their land, but we do have a number of outreach events. We have field days on the K-State campus. We do a lot of outreach in the entomology department, and we promote pollinator-friendly management practices. So we have conversations with homeowners as well. So even though most of our outreach is done with farm owners, simply because, again, we're using their land and it's sort of a thank you, here's the results from the stuff that we've done in your land. But we certainly do try to reach out to homeowners through our other sort of outreach activities. All right, any other questions?
I believe there was one more question. Dr. Pliaconi was wondering what difference you're anticipating regarding insect behavior between urban and rural environments.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be harder for insects because of the size differences. I think it's going to be harder for novel insects to find, a particular area. I think once they do find an area, they're going to have a hard time leaving that area just because of that isolation and connectivity issues. So I think, yeah, biodiversity, I suspect that biodiversity will be lower in these more central areas compared to more rural areas just because of the area effect. But if you can find ways to attract these beneficial insects, I think you'll have a good time, like try to, a good way of keeping them in there again, because, you know, they have a hard time moving and stuff like that.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
With that, I guess we will adjourn the webinar.